"Oh, another black girl thinking she's above the law just because she's driving this shiny car, huh?" The cop sneered, his tone soaked in contempt as he flicked his fingernail against Amira Washington's car window. A minor parking violation, and that alone was enough for them to handcuff her in broad daylight, as if they had just caught a wanted criminal. But they had no idea that the woman they were ridiculing on a crowded street would shake the entire system within a few hours. "In your state, you cops, like beasts, still have room to breathe? What state are you in?" The late afternoon sun slithered across the asphalt like glinting blades. Amira Washington quietly steered her car to the curb, a move so familiar it needed no thought. Her right tire nudged slightly over the white line, just enough that if someone was truly watching, they would have a pretext to claim a violation. She turned off the engine, unbuckled her seatbelt, and her eyes swept calmly over the rear-view mirror in a silent, practiced act of self-defense. And then she saw them, two shadows emerging from across the street. Green uniforms slung across their shoulders like a silent declaration of war. A burly blond man, hair cropped close, moved in first, his eyes scanning the sleek black paint of the car before settling on Amira's warm brown skin, as if he were calculating the fault level of merchandise pre-assigned, a value the day it rolled off the factory line. The other one, Blake, according to the name tag peeking from under his jacket lapel, flashed a smile as thin as paper. It was not the smile of a passerby greeting a stranger. It was the smile of someone savoring their privilege to look down. He didn't bother asking for documentation right away, nor did he explain the reason for his approach. He simply stood there, hands on his hips, as if claiming the space around her, his cold blue eyes dragging a line from Amira's neatly styled hair to the edge of her car mirror, ending with a smirk steeped in provocation. "Oh," Blake said, his voice slipping from his throat like a dull knife. "Another one who thinks traffic laws are just accessories for shiny black cars?" Each word tumbled onto the pavement, coarse and pointed enough to thicken the air around the car. "Henderson?" The other officer, younger, thinner, let out a short, hollow chuckle, a clumsy attempt to align himself with the stronger one, but the laugh rang hollow, awkward, doing nothing but carving deeper the divide between us and her. Amira did not reply. She simply tilted her head, her gaze slicing across Blake's face like a cold blade. No fear, no protest. Her look, silent and serene, was sharp enough to sever the flimsiest insults mid-air. Blake frowned briefly but quickly smoothed his features back into smugness. He stepped closer, his boots striking the sidewalk with dry, deliberate thuds. "You know parking like this is a traffic violation, right?" he said, his tone making it clear he wasn't seeking an answer. Amira remained silent, her hands resting lightly on her lap, as if she were offering him exactly the chance he was so desperate to seize. Blake glanced at Henderson, then smirked again, this time more viciously. "Looks like this car's a bit too good for the usual crowd that parks like this. Aw, Henderson." Henderson chuckled along, a thin, greasy laugh like cheap cigarette smoke. "Yeah, Blake," he said, his voice the sound of someone trying to laugh while standing on thin ice. "Seems like we've got ourselves a special character." Blake leaned into the car, bracing one hand on the edge of the hood, his face close enough that his breath fogged the glass between him and Amira. "Step out, Miss Special," he said, each word like shoving ice blocks into the atmosphere. Amira allowed the corner of her mouth to twitch into the faintest smirk, but made no move. Only her gaze, that same relentless gaze, slid up the rim of Blake's hat, then down the shiny badge pinned to his chest, as if she were weighing the real worth of the counterfeit jewelry he wore with such pride. The way she looked at him, not with fear, but with frozen contempt, made Blake instinctively step half a pace back, a reflex he quickly masked by slamming his hand against the hood. "Out of the car," he repeated, this time gritting his teeth, trying to cover the leaking edges of his crumbling swagger. Amira, without hurry, opened the door with a movement so slow it bordered on deliberate defiance. She stood up, straightening herself, not the posture of someone pleading or begging, but of someone who understood deeply that no matter where they stood, their dignity could not be measured by cheap glances. Blake cast his eyes downward at the tire, pointing at the part barely touching outside the white line. "There," he said, the soles of his shoes tapping an impatient rhythm against the pavement. "You think traffic laws are just suggestions here?" Henderson rushed to pull out his notepad, eager not to miss the chance to score points in front of Blake. Blake turned back to face Amira, the smile gone from his lips, leaving something simmering. Part hostility, part sick pleasure at the thought of trampling another under the boot of authority. "You're gonna regret thinking you could outsmart us," he muttered, low enough that only Amira could hear. But Amira did not blink. She stood there, silent and unyielding, like a statue carved from cold stone, her eyes responding without a single word. "No, I will not regret, and I will not fear you." An oppressive stillness fell over the scene. Passers-by began to slow, a few furtive glances stealing across the street. But Amira did not care. She knew that sometimes the greatest strength was not in shouting back, but in standing still, letting the villainy of others expose itself in the light. Blake squinted, feeling it, and because he felt it, he grew desperate to crush it, to kill whatever it was, whatever he did not understand but instinctively recognized as dangerous, before it could grow inside the calm facade of the woman standing before him. "Vehicle documents," Blake barked, thrusting his hand out sharply, his fingers tightening as if to prove the power he believed he held in his palm. Amira reached calmly into her handbag, retrieving her wallet, flipping it open with precision. She handed him her license and registration, her movements clean and exact, without the slightest trace of hesitation. Blake snatched them from her, his thumb pressing into the card as if trying to leave a visible imprint of authority. He flipped through the documents, his eyes scanning them with the greed of a vulture looking for an open wound. Henderson, standing beside him, glanced at Blake, then at Amira, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face, as if for a moment he too sensed something wrong in the cruel little game they were playing. But Blake's cold, ruthless, and menacing stare pulled him back. Amira stood there, motionless, a silent challenge to both men, and in that instant, in a single breath, the old order began to crack. The air around the car grew so thick it felt as if it could be sliced into pieces. Blake clutched the documents in his hand, the mocking grin lingering on his lips like a scar refusing to heal. But beneath that surface confidence, a seed of unease had sprouted, smoldering like embers under ash. Amira stood there, her posture straight like a sword unsheathed, her eyes fixed on the hands beginning to paw through her car with the eagerness of vultures catching the scent of rotting flesh. Blake rubbed the back of his gloved hand aggressively against the right window, as if hoping that from some meaningless smudge he could conjure a legitimate reason to drag her through the mud. He ground his teeth, scuffing the edge of the curb with his boot, leaving shallow scratches like claw marks on flesh. Every movement was calculated to make noise, to flood the atmosphere with an unspoken message. Here, power belongs to us, and you are just prey waiting to be stripped bare. Henderson, standing on the other side of the car, mimicked the actions more clumsily. He ran a gloved finger along the window groove, then pretended to frown and wrinkle his nose as if he had discovered something horrifying. Blake slapped the bundle of documents lightly against his palm, the sound sharp as a whip crack. He circled around the front of the car, his broad shoulders sprawling across the sidewalk, each step a grim reminder of the oppression he believed himself privileged to inflict. When he stopped before Amira, Blake did not request, he commanded. "Inspection papers and insurance," he barked, his voice not exactly a shout, but a brutal slash cutting through the air. Amira did not respond. Her gaze remained cold, as if his words were meaningless gusts brushing against a cliff that would never erode. She reached into her purse again, retrieving the insurance paper, her movements crisp, decisive, without the slightest hesitation. Blake snatched it, flipping it over and over, his eyes darting across the page like a venomous snake hunting for a weakness. His eyebrows lifted, then dropped. Small gestures that betrayed the twisted hunger seeping from his every pore. Henderson stood nearby, tilting his head, his eyes like a hunting dog waiting for the master's signal to attack. Blake licked his lips. He knew he held the advantage, and he relished it. "This car," he said, dripping sarcasm over every word, "is pretty slick. Doesn't quite fit the kind of girls who like breaking the rules, right, Henderson?" Henderson nodded along like a puppet. Blake stepped a half-pace closer, leaning down, planting his hands on his hips like a predator ready to strike. He shook the insurance document in his hand, jabbing his finger at the dates as if trying to rip the paper apart. "You know," he hissed, "when I first joined the force, they told me, the shinier the car, the dirtier the secrets inside." He spat an invisible glob onto the ground, his contempt made visible through his eyes alone, and blocked the path between Amira and the street like a wall of intimidation. Amira still said nothing. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but not out of fear. It was the gaze of someone recording every movement of the enemy, every fetid breath they exhaled. Like a knight tuning out the crowd's jeers to focus solely on the final strike, Blake extended his palm, fingers curling into segments like an old slaver summoning a captive to bow and chain. "Keys," he barked, his voice sickly sweet, but his twitching fingers betraying the diseased hunger for power that overwhelmed whatever logic he still possessed. Amira missed not a beat. She pulled out her keys, pinched between two fingers, handing them over like an item of no value. Her action was cold and clean as steel, unmarred by his cheap provocation. Blake snatched the keys, then signaled Henderson to search the vehicle, and so it began. Like scavengers digging through ashes for a single feather to salvage their honor, the two launched their hunt. Henderson wiped his hand over the leather seats, pressed his face to the window grooves, knelt to peer under the chassis, even scraped his boot against the bumper, deliberately scuffing it, to later accuse her of failing to maintain the vehicle. Blake patted the car's body like slapping a corpse. "Well, well, well," he drawled, his voice snaking out like a reptile flicking its tongue. "This is a nice car. Shame it belongs to someone who doesn't know how to respect the law." Yet Amira did not flinch. She stood there, her hands loose at her sides, her shoulders immovable like stone outcrops in a desert sandstorm. Her silence, neither pleading nor justifying, was a silent slap across Blake's face, and it only made him more desperate to shred that defiance into pieces. Blake growled, turning to face Amira again, his stare weighing down like lead. "Listen," he said, attempting to paint on a facade of fake civility. "I'm giving you a chance here. If you cooperate, maybe we can keep this light." But Amira only curled the corner of her mouth, not enough to call it a smile, just a subtle tightening, enough to turn Blake's words into dust before they could even touch her. But in that moment, the moment Blake's hand unconsciously clenched into a fist, released, and clenched again, the irreversible shift of the game was sealed. He did not know it, but he had already lost, right then and there. Blake snapped his fingers. A dry, sharp sound sliced through the remaining space between him and Amira. The insurance paper was flicked up before her face, tapping lightly against the air like a backhanded slap. "Expired. 1 day," Blake sneered, his eyes locking onto Amira as if he were staring at someone who had just signed her own sentence. Henderson whistled softly, his gaze gleaming with cheap delight. Blake did not wait. He pulled out his handcuffs from his belt, spinning them once, the metal grinding against itself in a screech that flooded the street with razor-sharp tension. "We are obligated to cuff you," Blake said, his voice laced with twisted pleasure, "for the safety of the community," each word scraped out like a blade dragging across concrete. Amira stood still, unmoving. Her eyes swept over Blake like a glacial gust, carrying nothing but pure disdain. Blake chuckled dryly, stepping forward, his large hand clamping onto Amir's wrist with more force than necessary. "How about that? The law your shiny car likes to decorate itself with, now it's yours to wear." He twisted Amira's arm behind her back, the movement sharp and ostentatious, a crude display of power. The click of the cuffs locking in place echoed coldly, like a verdict stamped with finality. Henderson snickered, leaning lazily against the car's hood, watching the scene unfold as if it were some cheap play staged solely for his amusement. Blake leaned close to Amira's ear, his breath reeking of stale coffee and arrogance, whispering, "Familiar feeling? Or is this your first time?" Amira turned her head, her gaze piercing straight into the hollow pupils of his eyes, a look without words, but more than enough to make Blake's forehead tingle. He laughed. Short, hollow, a laugh thrown out just to fill the void, masking the brief tremor that had flashed across his mind. Blake grabbed her other arm, twisting it slightly, applying a calculated pressure designed to make the faint-hearted cry out. Amira remained silent. Not a single sound escaped her. It was this silence, the silence that refused submission, that unsettled Blake more than he dared admit. "Who do you think you are, huh?" he growled, locking the second cuff around her wrist. "Law doesn't give a damn about shiny cars or brown skin, Miss Special." Blake shoved Amira against the side of the car, her back thudding lightly against the cold metal. He wanted her to hurt. He wanted her to crumble. But Amira merely lifted her chin, her gaze weighing heavily on him, forcing him for the first time to glance away. Henderson flicked his fingernail against the car window, sighed exaggeratedly, and muttered, "Well, just another glorious day in law enforcement history." Blake pretended not to hear. He grabbed the chain of the cuffs and yanked Amira into the middle of the street like a prize dragged from the battlefield. Passers-by began to slow. Eyes, so many eyes, phones lifted into the air. But Blake did not care. He was lost in the moment, anointing himself as judge and jury. "This is how we keep order," he barked, each word louder than necessary, as if preaching to the entire street. "No matter what car they drive, what clothes they wear, or what title they carry." He hauled Amira along, each tug a deliberate attempt to shred her dignity piece by piece before the public's gaze. Amira did not resist. She allowed herself to be dragged like a heavy anchor, quietly cracking the ice of Blake's self-satisfaction underfoot, without him even realizing it. Amira walked under the dying sunlight, her wrists twisted behind her back, each link of the steel cuffs scraping against her skin with a cold, dry rattle. Blake gripped the chain tightly, dragging her with every step, as if she were a living testament to the hollow power he was desperately clinging on to. Henderson followed behind, his eyes darting nervously, his limbs clumsy, as if even he no longer believed in the crude script they were staging. The sound of boots striking the pavement created a grim rhythm that echoed down the street, which was beginning to thicken with life. Pedestrians gradually clustered into little pockets of onlookers, their worried, hesitant gazes flickering toward her. But no one dared step forward. No one dared place themselves between the steel cuffs and the uniform. Blake sneered, his eyes sweeping across the crowd like a dull blade. He loved this feeling, standing in the middle of the street, hoisting his trophy like a conquering warrior. "Look at that," he snarled, deliberately loud enough for the bystanders to hear. "Even a shiny car can't cover up disobedience." Henderson chuckled dryly, but the laugh never reached his eyes. He shoved his hands into his pockets, kicked a pebble at his feet, pretending not to notice the phones beginning to lift into the air. And then, slicing through the thickened silence of the crowd, came a gruff voice, tearing apart the stagnant air. An old man's voice, raspy from cigarettes and time, rang out. "Handcuffed for a parking violation? Are you people out of your minds?" The question was not aimed at anyone specific, but it stabbed straight into the hollow performance. Blake was desperately trying to maintain. He spun around, a flash of anger lighting his eyes, but quickly swallowed it into a sneer of contempt. "I don't remember asking for your opinion," Blake said sweetly, his voice dripping poison, before turning his back and yanking Amira harder, as if punishing the man who had spoken. But the growl of recording phones did not stop. Another lens captured the image, steel cuffs biting into Amira's wrists, her face, calm, defiant, utterly devoid of plea, blazing against the gathering darkness. A young woman, perhaps in her 20s, burst from the crowd, shouting, her voice shattering the stagnant air. "Handcuffing someone over parking? Are you even using your brains?" Henderson flinched. Blake tightened his grip on the cuffs. "Move aside," he bellowed, his face flushed red. But the young woman did not move. She planted herself right in front of him, her phone trembling in her hands but unwavering, capturing every wretched expression Blake could no longer hide. Her eyes blazed with fury, fearless. Her breath quivered with rage. She did not know who Amira was. She only saw a human being treated like trash in broad daylight, and that was enough. Blake stepped forward, shoving her with his shoulder, his eyes sparking with the cold fire of petty authority challenged. "Last warning," he hissed through gritted teeth. "Stand down or be arrested for obstruction of justice." The young woman laughed, a strangled, bitter sound. "Obstruction of justice?" she shouted, tears glistening in her eyes. "You call this justice?" The old man from earlier took a half-step forward, his phone trembling in his hand but never lowering. His eyes, bloodshot, ringed with fatigue, shot a cold, contemptuous glare at Blake. Amira glanced over her shoulder. A flicker of light passed through her eyes. Not cheap hope, but a cold acknowledgement that these witnesses would be the first stones to shatter the mask Blake wore. Blake turned back to Amira, his gaze hardening, growing more hostile, more violent. He seized her shoulder, shoving her toward the patrol car. "Move!" he growled, his grip tightening as if trying to crush her shoulder blade. Amira did not resist. She walked forward steadily, as if each step she took was a silent blow against the tattered pride of her captors. The crowd began to murmur. A woman pulled out her phone. A young man in a hoodie retrieved a GoPro from his backpack and strapped it to his chest, recording openly. The atmosphere shifted, thickened, and became suffocating. Each shutter click, each tiny red recording light, was like a needle stabbing into the thick hide of the power that now squirmed in panic. Blake felt it. He knew the crowd was swelling. He knew that every step he took was becoming a piece of evidence against him. But he had gone too far to turn back, and the diseased ego within him, the part that believed a pair of cuffs could crush another's dignity, still drove him forward. He shoved Amira into the back of the patrol car. Henderson fumbled with the door, his face blanching as he saw the sea of phones pointed straight at him. Amira turned her head, her eyes sweeping over the crowd, not seeking rescue, not in despair, but silently declaring that the battle had officially begun. As Henderson fumbled with the patrol car door, his fingers clumsy as if every fingertip were sweating, Blake pressed Amira against the hood with unnecessary force. The metal groaned with a heavy, muffled clang, echoing through a street silenced by bottled fury. The freezing hood pressed against Amira's body, but she did not flinch, did not tense up, did not even gasp in pain as Blake was waiting for. She stood still, her hands cuffed behind her back, her shoulders straight, her posture resembling an unyielding stone statue daring the storm to wear it down. Blake leaned in, whispering into her ear with a low, thick voice dripping with mockery and sick satisfaction. "Now who's bowing down, huh?" He pushed harder, hoping for a cry, a shudder, or at least a pleading glance from the subdued. Instead, Amira lifted her head, her gaze brushing past his shoulder, striking Blake not with words, not with screams, but with a frozen bullet piercing the smug armor he wore. Not a word escaped her closed lips, but within that gaze, so deep it seemed it could bore through the very shell of Blake's brain, lay everything: contempt, rejection, the ruthless resolve of someone who understood that these cuffs were nothing but cheap toys, incapable of shackling a soul. Blake blinked, his chest tightening in an unconscious moment, as if his most primal instincts realized he had no control over her, that all he was doing was staging a pitiful play for his own hollow strength. Henderson stood a few steps away, his hand holding the radio, trembling slightly, his eyes briefly meeting Amira's, and he had to look away not because of the phone's filming, not because of fear for his career, but because he could not bear the sensation of being stripped bare by a silent gaze so piercing it felt like Amira had seen right through to the pathetic smallness hiding beneath his uniform. Blake gritted his teeth, pressing his hand harder into Amira's shoulder, his body straining as if a bit more force could break her will. "Face down," he hissed, his voice cracking through the air like a whip lashing into nothingness. Amira did not move. She simply turned her head enough to face him directly, and in that instant, as Blake looked deep into her eyes, he realized he was not facing a woman, He was staring into an abyss, a pitch-black chasm filled with unspoken verdicts, with accusations silently waiting to crash down. A flick of Blake's eyes toward Henderson, a silent order curled at the corner of his mouth. Then he had to release Amira's shoulder to avoid meeting her gaze, a small act that eroded the last crumbling remnants of power he had been clinging to. Henderson stepped forward, reaching for the door handle, but his movement was hesitant, as if just touching it would ignite him in the silent fire rising from all the eyes watching. The phones remained raised, the gazes stayed fixed on Amira, and in the compressed space between them all, she stood there, cuffed, pressed against the cold hood, but never once appearing defeated. Blake cursed under his breath, then crouched beside Amira, leaning closer than necessary, as if trying to drown her under the stench of his rotting authority. "Think you're special, huh?" he sneered, his voice corroded like rusted steel nice car. "Nice skin, nice attitude, but in the end, just another girl who thinks the law is a decoration." Amira did not reply. She simply curled one corner of her mouth, a movement so small it seemed invisible, yet enough to slice Blake's smug facade apart like a cold blade. Blake slammed his hand hard against the hood, the sharp, dry sound cutting across the street like a strangled, frustrated scream. He yanked Amira upright by the cuffs, jerking her like a wooden puppet. But even as he pulled, it was clear she moved at her own pace, every step steady, light yet unyielding. So, as if she were the one dragging Blake through the swamp of shame he had poured upon himself. Blake's hand trembled. Henderson flung the car door open, the hinge shrieking a mournful note like a warning from the city itself. Amira turned her head, giving Blake one last look before being forced into the back seat. That gaze, wordless, without a scream, stabbed into Blake like a spear, piercing straight through the armor of pride he had tried to hide behind. And for the first time that afternoon he felt cold, not from the steel cuffs, not from the crowd's stares, but from a raw primal fear that he had tangled with the wrong one. In this game, he would no longer be the one to finish. The slam of the car door echoed like a hammer striking the pavement, brutal and final, but its reverberation had barely begun to fade before it was swallowed by the silent blinking of phones around the street. Blake stood upright, adjusting his belt with an exaggerated motion as if he had just secured a conquest worthy of a medal, while Henderson quickly turned away, hiding his wavering gaze behind cheap sunglasses. The fury simmering beneath Blake's skin still festered, driving him to land one final blow, a cut meant to finish off the hateful silence Amira had left lingering like an open wound on the city's heart. He slammed his hand against the car roof, turning to glare at the crowd with a look of raw challenge, his voice slicing through the air like a man chewing on glass. "Record all you want, take your pictures, but don't forget, here, the law is still the law." A middle-aged man shook his head quietly, while the young woman continued aiming her lens at him, her eyes never leaving the steel cuffs biting into Amira's wrists like scars made of metal. Blake opened the front door of the patrol car, preparing to slide into the driver's seat when he suddenly remembered a procedural step he had nearly skipped in his triumph: the citation. A mere formality, but necessary to legitimize the predatory show he had just performed in front of dozens of watchful eyes. He turned back, squinting, pulling a ticket form from his chest pocket. "Name," he said, his voice lazy yet edged with irritation, as if scribbling a few lines over an already deep wound was a waste of his time. Amira, seated in the back, her hands cuffed, did not lift her head immediately. She slowly turned her face toward the window, her eyes drifting indifferently over the flashing car lights, over the half-curious, half-angry faces forming an outer ring. Blake tapped the form against the window frame, the sharp thuds hammering against the eardrums. "Name?" he repeated, this time with his voice tightened, like a man realizing the game was starting to slip from his fingers. Amira turned her head, her gaze slowly finding him, a look that carried no accusation, no hatred, only pure surgical coldness, like a razor gliding across a wrist without drawing blood, but leaving a stain of fear that could never be scrubbed clean. Amira," she said, her voice calm as a prayer recited at the Last Judgment. "Amira, Washington. In that instant, when the name dropped, the air sagged like a taut skin suddenly pierced. A man in the crowd, the one who had been filming since the beginning, froze, his eyes widening as if witnessing an earthquake. Amira. Blake furrowed his brow, his hand crushing the ticket form so tightly the creases etched into it like cracks in rotting wood. Henderson whipped his head around, shooting a panicked glance at Amira, then back at Blake, searching for instruction, but Blake only stood frozen like a plaster statue dissolving under acid rain. Washington. The name was not merely a noun, not merely a surname. It was a loaded bullet, a silent verdict waiting to detonate in the heart of the street. Whispers began to ripple outward, small waves mounting into an inevitable flood. The name was a torch thrust into a powder keg, and only a spark was needed for the explosion. The cameraman's hand shook as he zoomed in on Amira's face through the window. One name, one face, one moment of silence, enough to turn the video into irrefutable evidence of arrogance and stupidity digging their own grave. Blake let the ticket form fall to the floor, his hand searching for something solid to hold on to, but finding only empty air. In his mind, a series of assumptions ignited like matches struck against an empty box. Washington? Could it be that Washington, the one who had sued the federal government, the daughter of the civil rights judge? Blake glanced at Henderson, hoping to find denial, reassurance in his eyes, but Henderson looked worse than a lost child abandoned in a marketplace, his hands trembling, his gaze glued to Amira, as if she had morphed into death itself. Blake swallowed hard. He had never felt his throat constrict like this before. Amira still sat there, silent as an immovable mountain. Her eyes, cold, deep, merciless, stared quietly out the window where the crowd was beginning to kindle a storm Blake could no longer extinguish with cheap cuffs or hollow threats. Across the street, an elderly woman with a cane muttered something to a little boy. A woman in business attire quietly activated her phone camera. A man in a baseball cap removed his earbuds, turning toward the crowd, as if waiting for one final detail before choosing his side. The name Washington spread silently through the crowd like an invisible flame, catching in every glance, every breath. The man holding the camera from earlier seemed to jolt awake from a dream. He stepped back half a pace, his hands trembling but never ceasing to record, the lens shaking in rhythm with his racing heart. The young woman, who had earlier screamed in anger, now looked at Amira with a gaze of awe mixed with fervent belief, as if she had just brushed against a living piece of history. A middle-aged woman in a light blue business dress leaned toward the young woman and whispered, her voice heavy as stones tossed into a still lake. Her mother's a civil rights judge, and she sued 3 police departments, won all 3. That statement struck like a bullet straight into the skulls of those drowning in illusions of power. The young woman gaped, gripping her phone as if clutching living proof in her hands. The silent wave began to swell and break. A group of young men approached from the street corner, AirPods in their ears, their eyes blazing as snippets of truth reached them. An elderly woman halted on the sidewalk, her cloudy eyes seeming to light up when the name Washington was spoken again, louder this time, soaked in the storm of doubt now bubbling beneath the city's skin. Henderson clenched his fists, suppressing a groan as sweat pooled beneath his rubber gloves. He instinctively stepped back while Blake stood frozen, his face flushing red and then paling within seconds. No sirens were needed, no clinking cuffs in the street. The truth had broken loose like a flood, and the 2 cops had just played executioner to the death sentences of their own careers. A child around 10 years old tugged at his mother's sleeve, his voice innocent but sharp as a knife. "Mom, did they just handcuff a superhero?" The mother did not answer. She simply pulled him closer, her eyes burning toward Blake with a contempt that no formal accusation could fully express. Blake squirmed, his mouth twitching as he struggled to push out a justification, but his throat closed in, choked by a fear that had no name. A fear that only visits a man used to abusing others when he realizes he himself is naked before the world, with no badge big enough to cover the rot underneath. "Washington," Henderson muttered, barely aware he was speaking aloud. He glanced at the crowd, people he once dismissed as faceless background, now transformed into living witnesses, each phone raised like a looming verdict, each silent gaze a sharpened blade ready to cut through his fragile shield. Blake yanked the patrol car door open, tending to drag Amira out and seize back control. But the moment his hand reached in, Amira's gaze, silent, needing no scream, no cry, pinned him to the ground like a freezing nail. In that gaze, Blake no longer saw a handcuffed woman, no longer saw a victim. He saw an indictment waiting to be read aloud in court, a legal storm gathering above him, and his own image, shabby, humiliated, defeated, drifting toward a disgrace no power could salvage. A young man in the crowd switched his phone to speaker mode, his voice trembling with excitement. "Washington, it's really her. She sued the city last year, won big time." Another girl, her hair braided with colorful fabric, shouted at the top of her lungs as if silence was no longer an option. "They cuffed the wrong person. They cuffed the wrong person." The wave broke. Chants, flashing lights, curses, and the pounding of feet against the sidewalk erupted. Blake staggered backward, crashing into Henderson, the two of them stumbling like puppets with cut strings. But it was far too late. Amira sat calmly in the car, wrists twisted behind her back, body immobilized, but her spirit blazed like a quiet fire, incinerating every fake justification Blake and Henderson once thought could shield them. The man with the camera clenched his fist, whispering into his trembling lens, "This won't be buried. Not this time." Across the street, a group began to chant, "Justice for Amira, justice for Amira." The chant spread like wildfire, sweeping across the pavement, climbing up the weathered shop signs, igniting the air itself. Blake roared, trying to shout over the crowd, "Disperse! Disperse immediately!" But his voice was swallowed by the swelling sea of people, by the phones live streaming the incident to every corner of the city, where within an hour his name would become the center of a national interrogation over abuse of power, racial discrimination, and the stubborn, stupid arrogance that refused to die. And at the center of that storm, Amira Washington remained seated, silent, not waving, not speaking, not weeping. Only her eyes, that unspoken gaze, continued to pierce into the very spines of those who thought they could chain the blood of a lineage never meant for cheap cuffs. The chants of "Justice for Amira" had barely begun to fade when a burst of white light flashed through the crowd. A phone, live streaming, unleashing images across every platform like a silent bomb, its force 1,000 times more devastating than physical violence. The clip captured Amira being handcuffed over a meaningless parking violation, caught every arrogant glance from Blake, every filthy smirk from Henderson, every deliberate tightening of the cuffs around her wrist, every bead of guilty sweat pouring from those who had just realized they had touched a bloodline that would never submit. Within less than 10 minutes, the first video skyrocketed to the top of Twitter's regional trending list, and within less than 5 minutes after that, the hashtags "Justice for Amira" and "Parking While Black" flooded the networks like an unstoppable tidal wave. Tweets poured in. Who is she that made them shake like that? Arrested for parking or for her skin color. This is no longer a traffic violation. This is a crime of power. A young woman in the crowd, her lipstick smudged, yanked her mask down, raised her phone high, her eyes blazing with fury as she live-streamed directly. Everyone watching. "Look, they just handcuffed a woman because her car was a few inches over the line. Look at their faces. Look at how he slammed her into the car. Look at how he smirked like a beast catching prey. Do you understand? This is not about breaking a law. This is a hunt." Each word she shouted poured more fuel onto the fire smoldering in society's heart. Each image, each scream, each flash of light widened the cracks in the wall of violence long hidden behind the cloak of law enforcement. Blake looked around, seeing the raised phones like cold gun barrels pointed straight at him, and for the first time in his policing career, he felt naked, exposed under a justice he could not twist with fake reports or fabricated testimonies. Henderson sank deeper into the shadow of the patrol car, sweat pouring down, his knees shaking as if a strong gust of wind could topple him. Sirens wailed from a distance, green and red lights swirling across car windows, cameras, reflecting off Blake's stiffening face, but instead of rescue, those cars carried the cold stares of internal affairs officers. Men Blake knew all too well. They were not coming to back him up. They were coming to open an investigation right there on the scene. A freelance reporter, armed with professional live-stream gear, pushed through the edge of the crowd, his zoom lens capturing every damning detail. The steel cuffs cutting into Amira's wrists, Henderson's blue shirt soaked with sweat, Blake's flushed face battling a rising tide of desperation. Amira sat calmly in the car, her gaze unchanged, serene, as if observing from above, like a silent judge noting every crime without needing a defense, without needing a verdict, because the actions themselves were the perfect confession. A bearded young man, wearing an anti-racism bracelet, screamed into his camera, "No one is safe if this is allowed to happen. No one has the right to trample a person's dignity under the name of the law. Today it's her. Tomorrow it could be your sister, your mother, your daughter. Are you going to stand by and do nothing?" The hashtag Justice for Amira surpassed 300,000 mentions in just 20 minutes and continued growing exponentially. Influential figures began sharing the video. Civil rights lawyers, celebrities, international journalists, all creating a tsunami of information that drowned any weak attempt Blake might make to defend himself. One live stream hit nearly 1 million concurrent viewers, and the streamer closed it with a line that made the crowd erupt. "You didn't just handcuff the wrong person, you handcuffed yourselves." Blake clenched his teeth, his fingers whitening as they squeezed the belt strap. He glanced quickly at Henderson and saw only fear, despair, and betrayal in his partner's eyes, spilling out like a breached dam. Across the street, the LED screen of a phone store abruptly switched to a breaking news alert. Breaking news: the unjust arrest of Amira Washington is shaking social media. Below, the news ticker scrolled urgently. Department of Justice demands collection of all on-site footage. The air thickened. The once bustling street fell into a strange kind of silence. The silence of an earthquake's first rumble. Amira turned her face toward the crowd, her eyes not seeking comfort, not pleading for support. She simply stared, like a flag standing tall without wind. And one by one, the people understood that this battle was not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been crushed, ever been handcuffed by a system that believed skin color or status defined a person's worth. This was no longer about a handcuffing, no longer about a parking violation. This was a justice explosion, and no one could look away anymore. The tide of people outside kept surging, the chants of "Justice for Amira" blending with the wail of sirens, the frantic tapping of fingers over phone screens, the stomping of feet against the scorching pavement, forming a rebellious symphony that echoed across the street. Inside the patrol car, Blake sat rigidly in the driver's seat, his face hardened, every tendon in his neck taut like overstrained ropes. He stole a glance into the rearview mirror and caught Amira's gaze, unbroken, unshaken, a silent slash forcing him to inhale sharply to keep from collapsing right there behind the wheel. Henderson sat beside him, clutching the radio, his thumb fumbling uselessly over the button, not knowing what to report, not knowing who to plead to, not knowing what scrap of power he could still cling to in the tsunami overturning every illusion around them. Then Blake's phone rang, a shrill, cold sound that pierced through the shouting outside and stabbed straight into his overstretched brain. He stared at the lit-up screen, his throat constricting as he read the 3 short words flashing there. Department of Justice. He considered ignoring it, pretending he hadn't seen, but some primal instinct, some deep-seated fear embedded in his blood compelled him, in the most foolish panic of his life, to press the answer button, like a condemned man tightening his own noose. "Officer Blake?" the voice on the other end said, calm, cold, not raised but with each word dropping into his ear like stones into a bottomless pit. "You and Officer Henderson are hereby ordered to immediate suspension. Surrender your weapons and badges to the commanding officer at the scene, immediately." Blake swallowed hard, the motion heavy as if he were forcing down a block of concrete. Henderson heard it too, and his face drained of color as if his blood had been siphoned out. His lips parted, trembling, but no words came. Blake opened his mouth, ready to protest, to howl like a trapped beast, but the line went dead, leaving behind a thick silence as heavy as sludge at the bottom of a swamp. Blake turned toward Henderson, his eyes flashing panic and despair, then quickly recoiling into a posture of brute rage like a wounded bull. He grabbed the radio and barked out meaningless orders about crowd control and protection of public property, but his voice cracked, distorted like wind howling through a broken doorframe. Outside, the original cameraman, the elderly man with silver hair, live-streamed the announcement of their suspension, as if even nature had chosen to side with justice that day. The clip spread rapidly, captioned simply but heavily, "Police suspended on the spot. They know they're wrong." Blake gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw clenched so hard that the grinding of his teeth could be heard. He exploded in a brief, pitiful moment of rage, ripping the badge from his chest and hurling it onto the dashboard like a child throwing a broken toy. But the gesture only exposed his helplessness to the watching street, rather than restoring any scrap of dignity. Henderson reacted differently. He pulled out his badge with trembling hands, like a man stripping naked in freezing cold. When he dropped it onto the seat, Henderson looked like an empty shell, hollow-eyed, his shoulders collapsing like rotten pillars crushed by the wind. Amira, sitting in the back seat, did not blink. She simply tilted her head slightly, her gaze quietly absorbing the disintegration of the men who once thought cheap force could break her. Her silence, forged of cold steel and an unshakable faith, became the final judgment for the two defeated officers, requiring no other verdict. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers at the sight of the badges falling, and that cheer quickly escalated into a storm that swept away every desperate excuse the police might have clung to. Each clap, each chant of "Amira, Amira, Amira," pounded against Blake's chest, shattering every last piece of cheap pride he still tried to salvage. The curtain had fallen. No maneuver could save them now. No plea could soften the truth. Only the naked, freezing reality remained, dancing before their eyes like ghostly reminders that those who sow the wind shall reap the storm. Another wave had begun to rise, a wave more dangerous, more insidious, but devastating to the very roots. Fingers were no longer just sharing the live stream of Amira being handcuffed. They were digging deeper, dredging up old wounds the local police department had thought buried under glossy reports and hollow apologies. Posts flooded in like a monsoon. Officer Blake threatened me back in 2018. My son was dragged out of a car by Henderson just for not buckling the front seat belt. Remember the case where they handcuffed a 13-year-old girl right on school grounds? That was this department. Each line, each secondary hashtag surfaced like corpses pulled from the bottom of a swamp. Stories that once lingered in shadows now rose with the community's rage, raw and glaring like scars never allowed to heal. The town's tiny newspaper, which once only reported on spring fairs and high school baseball, now exploded with reposted complaints and lawsuits. A young black girl arrested for selling cookies without a permit. A father handcuffed in front of his daughter for stopping too long at a red light. A mother shoved to the ground just for asking directions with imperfect English. The rage did not stay confined to screens. At the police station, crowds began to gather at the gate, waving crudely scrawled signs. "Justice for Amira, shut it down, Blake must pay." Someone hurled rotten eggs at the department's sign, stripping its golden paint into a jagged mask of exposed lies. Teenagers erected cardboard cutouts of police officers, looped small nooses around their necks, and dragged them around the square like a living indictment for those who once believed badges could cover sins. Meanwhile, at the cafe where retired officers once gathered, the owner, without offering any explanation, hung a bold sign, "No service for racists." Uniformed patrons were turned away at the door, forced to slink out the back under the jeering stares of a crowd waiting just for them. The air in town thickened, suffocating. Every glance, every sneeze seemed ready to ignite an explosion. An elderly black woman quietly approached the station's gates and placed down an old wooden box filled with copies of the complaint forms her son had filed 5 years earlier, all ignored by the department. Not a word, not a tear, just a cold, direct look. Before she turned away, leaving the weight of past and present pressing down on the cracked bricks at the department's doorstep. The once weaponized silence, the silence the system had used to swallow citizens' dignity, shattered like glass, riddled with bullets of truth. Civil lawsuits poured into City Hall like a tsunami of paperwork. Civil rights groups, independent attorneys, and black community advocacy groups all descended, collating records, preparing the largest legal offensive the town had ever seen. National news stations, which once overlooked this tiny town nestled among barren hills, now sent reporters to camp at the station gates, their cameras capturing every bead of sweat, every awkward gesture of officials who once strutted out of that building with smugness. Blake slumped onto the patrol car's running board, his massive hands clutching his head like a man waking up from a nightmare, only to realize the nightmare was just beginning. Sweat poured from him, mixing with the dust clinging to his now disgraced uniform. Henderson dragged himself nearby, collapsing beside him, his eyes hollow, his mouth opening and closing, as if searching for some excuse, but producing only the useless gasps of a dying creature. Inside the chief's office, the internal phone had been ringing non-stop for half an hour. Complaints, press inquiries, demands for internal data, they piled up like mountains. The dispatcher's hands trembled as she sorted through them, each message a slap across the sagging face of a system that once thought itself untouchable. Once proud faces now avoided eye contact in the chilled corridors, each sidelong glance cutting into their hollow dignity like a knife turned inward. They knew, right now, that every whispered insult, every unfilmed beating, every half-veiled threat was being dragged into the blinding spotlight of social media, of law, of unleashed rage. The atmosphere inside the building grew so suffocating that even footsteps sounded like collisions. A middle-aged officer, infamous for bullying civilians, stepped off the elevator and was immediately shoved against the wall by a young mother, her finger jabbing into his chest as she screamed, "You screamed in my child's face. Now the whole world will scream in yours." The hallway fell silent, save for the clicking of cameras capturing the moment, hammering at the long-standing arrogance of the system. In the station parking lot, a group of teenagers gathered, no guns, no stones, just silent, masked faces with "We Remember" printed across them. When an officer emerged, they raised posters showing the faces of past victims of police brutality in that very town, each image a brutal mirror, forcing the officers to confront their own shame. Several officers hurried away, unable to endure the wordless accusations burned into the air. At their once favorite cafe, a public humiliation unfolded. The cafe owner, a wealthy white man whose daughter married a black man, stepped out and one by one pointed at each officer, declaring, "I don't serve abusers of power." Before stunned onlookers, he personally ripped the decorative badge off an old officer's uniform and tossed it into the trash. A gesture captured on video that went viral within hours, a slap in the face of a system once parading itself as a model of order. Even inside the supermarket, officers could not escape. Customers filmed them relentlessly. A tall black man approached a cop once notorious for brutality, coolly placed a pack of sanitary pads on the checkout counter and said, "For the wound on your honor." Laughter exploded around them, while the officers stood frozen, face blazing red, as the cameras kept rolling. It was no longer just Blake and Henderson, an entire rotund of abuse, a machine fueled by disdain, by stepping on the necks of the powerless, had been unearthed, bubbling and festering, with nowhere left to hide. From dusty notebooks, forgotten reports, and crude victim recordings once dismissed, a grotesque picture emerged. Baseless arrests, coerced juvenile confessions, falsified evidence, blatant racial profiling during patrols. The New York Times dispatched reporters. Organizations like the ACLU and Human Rights Watch launched investigations. Independent lawyers opened hotlines for witnesses and encouraged lawsuit submission. The media storm no longer revolved solely around Amira Washington. It had become a cleansing fire aimed at the entire system. Amira sat in the car that had now become the world's epicenter, her wrists still bound, her face still cold as it had been from the start. But her silence, the way she sat there, steadfast, without excuses, without pleas, was the spear that pierced the rotten pride of an entire machine long shielded by unchecked power. The crowd encircled the car, first with whispers, then with a swelling tide of anger. A black woman in a Black Lives Matter shirt approached, raised a clenched fist into the air, silent yet burning through every mask of falsehood power had worn. An old man knelt quietly by the curb, his face a map of wrinkles, eyes full of tears, one trembling hand clutching his chest, as if his heart was beating for pain too long, too deep. A little girl stood waving a small flag toward Amira, her black curls wild in the wind, her eyes bright with a future that would no longer bow its head. Across the street, a group of masked youth approached, carrying placards bearing the names of victims who had never seen justice, each name etched deeper into the heavy, furious, and hopeful air. When one officer tried to squeeze past to control the crowd, a middle-aged woman blocked him, throwing a stack of old complaint files into his chest and coldly asking, "Will you pretend not to see again?" There was no need for an answer. The officer's bowed head and retreating steps were answer enough. Meanwhile, farther off, a small truck slammed to a halt in front of the station. From its bed emerged massive banners displaying previously suppressed images. Black children pinned to the ground, mothers collapsing in grief outside precincts, even suicide notes from victims broken by injustice. The entire town could no longer feign ignorance. The truth lay bare, brutal, and unforgiving. A small civilian plane buzzed overhead, towing a blood-red banner. "You will kneel too." The crowd roared, not for revenge, but for liberation, a primal catharsis from years of silenced humiliation. In that moment, before all eyes, a young officer, still wearing his badge, trembled, removed his insignia, laid it on the boiling pavement, and walked away. No words, no footsteps following, only the dense silence of a system cracking under the weight of everything it had once scorned. No one needed to say it anymore. Every crime had already spoken for itself, and this time, for the first time in endless years, the system itself would have to bow. Not just two men, but an entire rot of abuse finally collapsed under the light of justice. The rot of abuse had been awakened, shattered into fragments under the cold gaze of society, and the tsunami of justice showed no sign of stopping. When the first badges hit the ground, when old abuse memos were dragged out of the rotting archive basements, it was not merely the images of two officers that crumbled, it was the entire decaying structure of power that had for so long rooted itself into the town's foundation like tumors gnawing at the soul of the community. The mainstream media no longer stopped at reporting. CNN, BBC, Reuters, all changed their headlines simultaneously. No longer a personal failure, a sign of systemic decay. Those words scrolled across screens like sharp blades slicing through the flesh of those still scrambling to cling to their tarnished pride. City Hall was besieged by reporters, microphones thrust into the faces of officials who once swaggered through conferences, draped in the robes of justice, now stammering, dodging, seeking escape from the rage boiling in every breath of the crowd. A female mayor, once proud of her security statistics, found herself trapped in the street when a black man shoved an old photo into her face, a picture of his son forced to kneel in the market by her very police force. And she froze, her face blanching as if slapped across the world stage. Inside the usual press briefing hall, the seats once reserved for officials now stood empty, while a group of law students sat silently, each holding a whiteboard scrawled in red ink. Who covered for them? How many cases are still buried? Is silence not a crime, too? No answers. No one dared step forward. No grand speeches could gloss it over now. Only a freezing emptiness remained, and the eyes of the public ricocheted like bullets off the crumbling walls of deceit they had built. Outside City Hall, a group of black veterans set up a protest camp, donning their old uniforms, standing silent but firm. They did not chant slogans, they did not scream. Their presence, men who had bled for the country only to be treated as second-class citizens on their own soil, was enough to make the once proud rulers lower their heads in shame. One veteran, his hair pure white, held a handwritten sign in chalk. "We did not fight for you to abuse your power." That simple, blinding sign was a verdict without a jury. Meanwhile, social media exploded with videos of former officers being ejected from restaurants, stores, and even local supermarkets. A deputy chief, trying to buy coffee at his usual corner cafe, was coldly shoved back out by the owner with a sentence like an icy dagger. "We don't serve federal investigation subjects here." The humiliation needed no whispering to spread. It played out openly, before hundreds of cameras, as punishment without a courtroom. No one believed the isolated incident narratives anymore. The truth, once exposed, did not need to scream. Crushed the polished masks erected over generations of mayors, police chiefs, and internal review boards that were nothing more than self-serving jokes. The Federal Department of Justice, bowing under public pressure, under the roar of civil groups, under the thunder of millions of outraged voices, had no choice but to sign off on a full-blown investigation. Not a casual audit, not a polite visit, but a formal federal probe with the authority to investigate, prosecute, and if necessary, dismantle the entire local police apparatus. The news broke at dawn, slicing through the town's lingering smog of false tranquility like a cleaver. The term pattern and practice investigation, glowing across every news banner, sounded like a death sentence being read aloud before the executioner swung the blade. Inside the police station, clerks scrambled to pack files, wipe hard drives, fumbling like rats flailing before a sinking ship. Lower-ranked officers cut their shifts short, hunkered deep inside patrol cars, avoiding every glance, every question, every camera, like ghosts realizing they had been dragged into the sunlight. At the main gate, townsfolk erected signs, "Uniformed criminals, they fear the light," then lined up, silently, waiting to taunt each disgraced officer walking out. "Keep walking, don't come back." The town's air thickened with unveiled contempt. The cafes, once serving as police haunts, now hung signs, "No service for investigated officers," turning once proud men into wandering ghosts searching for shelter. At a local supermarket, citizens organized a "No Sales for Abusers Day," with customers silently turning their backs whenever a uniformed officer entered, as if avoiding a contamination too foul to touch. A young officer tried to argue he was just following orders, but an old woman cut him off with a cold reply. "Following orders comes with a price, boy." Blake and Henderson, mere sacrificial pawns, were only the tip of an iceberg built from decades of arrogance and indifference. Now, every old testimony, every dismissed complaint, every ignored grievance was being unearthed piece by piece, assembling into an irrefutable portrait of darkness, a portrait that even the untouchables now had to face. News reports no longer named individuals, they simply labeled it all a rotten system. The rage spread into schools, where high school students organized their own sit-ins, carrying hand-painted signs reading, "You cannot teach ethics if you live a lie." The principal was cornered at the entrance and forced by students to publicly read his resignation letter for having shielded the school's police liaison program. Every small crack in the machinery widened into deep, unfixable chasms. A renowned human rights investigative journalist posted a single tweet that sent shivers through the town. Amira Washington was just the spark. The whole forest is catching fire. Immediately after, major human rights organizations issued joint statements demanding the Justice Department ensure this investigation would not end in hollow apologies, but with criminal prosecutions of everyone involved. from rookies to the police chief. Amira, at the heart of this media and political storm, remained seated, still cuffed, still without pleading. But from this moment on, she was no longer alone. An entire world stood behind her. A rising wave of outrage, hope, and demands for justice surged silently beneath her feet. Images of her serene face, unyielding eyes, blanketed social media, newspapers, and news broadcasts. No commentary was needed, just the image, letting the truth speak for itself. Outside the police station, a group of youth raised a massive black banner in the street. "We are all Amira." The white letters cut into the black fabric like a dagger, into the tattered pride of the old system. A young mother stood holding her son, raising a scribbled sign, "If one day my son is Amira, I will burn this whole town down for him." The crowd did not cheer. They simply stood, a silent tsunami about to sweep away every false monument. Blake, isolated in a temporary office, punched the wall, blood seeping from his knuckles. Yet the burning shame inside him scorched far worse. His once proud name was stripped from the achievement board and tossed into a trash bin before the administrative staff, like an excommunication ceremony. He understood now. No amount of blood, no amount of screaming could return him to the days when a falsified report could crush dissent. He had lost, not just to Amira, but to an entire era changing before his very eyes. Later, at the diner where officers once gathered after shifts, Blake entered in civilian clothes, hoping for a shred of familiarity. The diner fell dead silent. A young waiter approached, placed a blank check in front of him with a line scrawled in red ink, "We don't serve oppressors here." That wordless slap froze Blake in place, blood dripping from his hand onto the cold tile floor. In another corner, Henderson slumped over a table, tears streaking his ashen face. He, who once believed he could live quietly by just following orders, now faced the brutal truth. Complicity would drown him alongside the perpetrators. When Henderson tried to leave the station, a group of college students blocked his path. No shouting, no assault, just holding up black and white portraits of faceless victims Henderson and his comrades once ignored. Each photo struck him like a blazing brand, forcing him to bow his head and walk like a dead man yet to be buried. This was no longer about personal failure, no longer about one officer or two. This was the cracking of an entire system, and no press release, no apology speech could ever mend what had shattered. What broke would break all the way. Those who sowed the wind now must reap the storm, not with words but with the collapse of the very power they once wielded to crush others. The long-suppressed fury of a once strangled community surged up, unstoppable. When the date for the emergency hearing was announced, not a soul in town, not even those who had long hidden behind apathy, could pretend ignorance. City Hall was locked down by hundreds, then thousands, pouring in from everywhere, hands raised high, slogans glued to palms, eyes ablaze not with curiosity but with a burning demand for justice that could no longer be delayed by even a single second. Inside the courtroom, every seat was packed tight, the old wooden benches creaking under the weight of a crowd straining to contain every breath. There was no murmuring, no coughing, only a dense silence thick as a lead curtain, stretching the air so taut it seemed a single snap of fingers could shatter it into pieces. Blake entered the courtroom in a wrinkled civilian outfit, his face pale under the cold flicker of old fluorescent lights. Henderson trailed behind, shoulders hunched like a man already bound and shackled without a finger laid upon him. They moved slowly down the aisle, pierced by countless eyes. Invisible blades slashing every step they took, every breath they dared draw. No one shouted, no one threw stones, but the heavy silence alone drowned them deeper into the abyss of disgrace. The presiding judge, a black man with salt and pepper hair and a face carved from iron, banged the gavel to open proceedings, each strike thudding heavy as a funeral drum, heralding the inevitable death of a power rotten to its core. The prosecutor rose, his voice cold and sharp as a scalpel, needing no embellishment, no rhetoric, simply reading line after line of the case file, playing each video, and quoting each witness, was enough to suffocate the courtroom under the crushing weight of suppressed rage. The images played again and again. Amira Washington, handcuffed, pinned against a car hood, dragged down a street under a chorus of protest, slicing open the facade of order that Blake had once hidden behind. Amira's frozen face, her piercing gaze through the lens, burned itself into every mind, carving fissures no denier, however fanciful, could ever mend. Outside the courtroom, battered wooden signs lined the hallways. "We will not forget. No room for badge without honor." Every citizen passing through laid a hand upon those boards. A silent oath, a vow that this time justice would not be smothered by slick excuses. Right outside the door, a line of high school students stood neatly, each holding a small portrait of faceless victims, their eyes bright as beacons against the darkness that had stretched for decades. Blake sat at the defendant's table, clenching his hands into bone-white knots, darting glances around the room, searching for an ally, a sympathetic gaze, a shred of defense, but finding only relentless, unblinking stares. The accumulated resolve of generations once silenced, now risen not with swords but with an unstoppable will. Each time Blake shifted, each time his lips trembled, the room seemed to tighten, as if even the air was backing him into an inescapable corner. In the press row, a renowned black journalist silently lifted her camera, not aiming at the prosecutor or the evidence, but at Blake's every wrinkle, every bead of sweat trickling down his forehead. Her lens, needing no commentary, no narration, stripped away every mask, exposing a frail, filthy man burning under the ruthless light of truth. Henderson hunched low, lips pressed tight to stifle sobs, each awkward movement only making him more pitiful, more contemptible. A middle-aged man, clad in an old suit, abruptly rose from the gallery, pulling a crumpled paper from his pocket, a copy of a complaint his son had filed years ago, dismissed without explanation, and quietly placed it at Henderson's feet. No words, no shouting, yet the weight of that act made Henderson shudder like a condemned man paraded through the market square. The defense attorney, a balding white man, tried to spin tales of standard arrest procedure and public safety concerns, but every word he uttered only tightened the audience's fists, sped the journalists' shudders, and stripped Blake and Henderson further bare before the world. When the prosecutor closed his presentation with a simple sentence, "This is not just the fault of two individuals, this is the culmination of a system that has scorned human rights for decades," the room exploded in thunderous, restrained applause. Not prolonged, not chaotic, but sharp, relentless, resounding like a midsummer storm hammering against a rotting fortress. Each clap was a hammer blow against the rotted shell of arrogance, leaving no room for excuses, no crevice for retreat. Amira was brought into the courtroom mid-hearing, still handcuffed, a move as brutish as it was foolish by the police in their last desperate bid for order, but that image only crystallized her defiant strength. She did not bow her head, she did not avert her gaze, she did not beg. She simply walked forward, wrists bound, but spirit freer than anyone else in the room. As she passed, every eye tracked her like flames licking up dry timber, every clenched fist and sharp inhale bracing against the onslaught of emotion. An elderly black woman stood, unpinned a battered civil rights badge from her blouse, a relic from the 1960s, and pressed it silently into Amira's hand, her eyes ablaze with quiet pride. No words were needed. It was a torch passed in solemn honor. One by one, almost instinctively, the room rose to their feet as Amira passed, not from the command, not from ritual, but because every fiber of their being knew, here and now, they were witnessing a rebirth of dignity far beyond the reach of law or politics. In that taut moment, a young black boy in a school uniform slipped from his seat, walked to the barrier, and raised high a crayon drawing. Amira, handcuffed but with wings unfurled from her shoulders. No one dared breathe. Only the soft rustle of paper brushed by the air conditioner filled the silence. Blake saw it too, his lips pressed so hard they bled, his hands trembling violently but powerless to move. Sweat rolled down his temple, mixing with the bruise on his jaw, a mark from last night's scuffle and holding when a fellow officer, also now under investigation, silently unleashed all his hatred and despair onto Blake. For the first time in his life, Blake felt himself truly laid bare before a justice not shaped like handcuffs, not cloaked in false legality, but shining from the unforgiving gaze of ordinary people. Henderson buried his face in his knees, unable to meet the truth he had helped to create. Through tear-blurred eyes, he caught a glimpse of a black man in the front row, clutching a battered Bible tied with fraying rope, a symbol of vows carried across centuries of bondage. The man's silence, no curses, no condemnation, cut deeper than any formal accusation. When the judge finally declared, his voice resolute, "This hearing will lead to a full federal investigation into the entire operations of the city police department," the room no longer restrained itself. Cheers, sobs, and pounding fists erupted like a small earthquake, shaking the crumbling walls of a building that had witnessed too many dirty compromises. The first to rise were not fiery youths, but elders, those who had kept silent for lifetimes, now standing, raising faded photographs, long-buried evidence, a testament to the resilience that had never truly died. Journalists surged forward, cameras capturing every tear, every broken smile. No one remained seated that day. A young mother lifted her child high, like a living flag, her eyes burning a vow that her son would never again grow up fearing a uniform. A white college student, drenched in sweat and tears, ripped off his jacket to reveal a T-shirt reading "Justice or Nothing," raising his fist to the ceiling, a gesture that swept across the courtroom like wildfire. No one could turn away. Even court staff, normally stoic in their neutrality, bowed their heads as Amira passed. Her wrists still bruised, but her steps light, commanding. Each footfall resonated like a hammer blow on ancient stone, unsettling even those who once thought themselves fortress-like. No one had any excuse left for cowardice or complicity. Blake, from his isolated seat, tried to shrink himself into nothingness, but there was no escape. A line of black veterans, once soldiers under the same flag Blake had used to mask his violence, formed a silent barricade at the exit, staring him down with steel eyes, forcing him to lower his head, trembling like a guilty man dragged before a market crowd. Henderson, huddled against the wall, broke down into heaving sobs, his cry shattering against the walls now bursting with irreversible awakening. All must face it, all must rise, or be swept away by history alongside the rotting remnants of a system that, under the blinding light of truth that day, had finally declared itself finished. The air in the courtroom had barely begun to settle when another shockwave, fiercer and deeper, seeped through the cracks of the old city hall. As the final echoes of applause faded into the worn brick walls, a man in a deep gray suit, a representative of the Department of Justice, stepped into the center of the courtroom, his face frozen, his gaze sweeping silently over Blake, Henderson, and every other figure who once believed a badge alone placed them above the law. From his briefcase, he pulled a thick dossier, each page a blade driving into the already crumbling foundations of the system. In a steady, emotionless voice, he declared, "The Department of Justice has been conducting an internal investigation into civil rights violations within this police department for the past 2 years." A hushed wave swept through the crowd like a gust through a dry forest. Blake snapped his head up, his jaw clenching so hard that the veins at his temples twitched violently. Henderson opened his mouth, but only a hollow, gasping sound escaped. From the audience, an elderly woman pulled out a yellowed photograph, her son handcuffed in a schoolyard, and held it high above her head like an indictment that needed no reading. The act triggered a chain reaction. Others pulled out old complaint forms, long dismissed evidence, scraps of justice once brushed aside, now converging into a surging tide of fury, tightening around those who had once lounged atop rotten thrones of power. The man in gray paused, pulling out another thin document, each movement like another bucket of ice water thrown onto the dying embers of a once untouchable regime. To carry out this operation, he continued, his voice cold as steel scraping concrete, the department assigned an undercover inspector to infiltrate the system. This agent was authorized to gather evidence, file internal reports, and coordinate with the federal investigation. A collective exhale burst from the courtroom's lungs, all at once. In one corner, a group of young students, once harassed for random ID checks on school grounds, sprang to their feet, their faces fierce, arms crossed over their chests, eyes cold as ice, locking onto the defendants like spotlights over rats frozen in a sewer. The room thickened, breaths grew heavy. Blake's eyes darted frantically around, a cornered animal searching for the hidden blade among the very people he had once trampled and mocked. The man smiled coolly and turned toward Amira, still seated, wrists cuffed, her gaze unbroken. With a slow, deliberate nod, he gave the signal. Amira rose, the handcuffs clinking briefly before a federal agent stepped forward, unlocking them with a special key engraved with the department's insignia. The snap of the cuffs releasing cracked like thunder through the courtroom. Blake's eyes bulged. Henderson stumbled back 2 steps, his face draining of color, sweat pouring in visible streaks. At the back of the room, a black woman shakily pulled an old handkerchief from her pocket, waving it in the air like a silent battle flag. That lone gesture ignited the entire room. Rows of people stood, hands raised, not shouting, not chaotic, but surging, with an unstoppable, smoldering force that pinned the defendants frozen in their seats like shipwrecks battered by a relentless storm. Amira rubbed her wrists, casually, her movements so composed they bordered on disdain. She stepped forward, toward the witness stand, no longer restrained, no longer hidden, walking with the calm precision of a blade freshly drawn, glinting and unstoppable. The courtroom lights poured down, catching her every step, illuminating the fear twisted across faces like Blake's, now resembling nothing more than a defanged predator awaiting its final fall. And then Amira spoke, her voice steady, cutting straight into the hearts of those who once believed violence and apathy could bury justice forever. My name is Amira Washington. I am a special inspector for the Department of Justice, Division of Systemic Abuse and Discrimination Investigations. The roar that erupted from the audience defied restraint. Cries, cheers, choked sobs. Flashbulbs exploded like fireworks in a storm. Behind the press row, a group of students unfurled a massive painting. Amira breaking a pair of steel handcuffs, a symbol so fierce it seemed to blaze into life. Veterans stood tall, saluting her with eyes shining in a pride only earned by surviving battles that spanned lifetimes. Blake staggered, gripping the bench edge, his face contorting with shock, rage, and the sickening realization that everything he had built was collapsing beyond repair. He hissed through clenched teeth, a final, pathetic howl of a drowning man. We were set up. We were trapped. Amira stared straight into his soul, her smile cold and sharp as steel scraping stone, devoid of pity. No one set you up. You chained yourselves with your own arrogance and injustice. Every word felt like a bullet into the crumbling walls of their rotten empire. Every gaze fixed on her burned not just with admiration, but with a fierce, fevered belief that some battles were born to be won. In a corner, an elderly veteran clenched his battered cap, tears pooling in his eyes, pride radiating from his battered frame. Across the victims' benches, people rose one by one, no cue needed, only the raw pull of history demanding that they stand witness. Amira pulled from her pocket a real badge, the Department of Justice seal glinting under the courtroom lights, and raised it high above the roaring crowd. The room detonated into cheers, sobs, and thunderous applause. A young woman wept openly, clutching the person beside her as if grasping back the dignity once stolen. Photographers jostled for position, flashbulbs blazing like winter fireworks, immortalizing the moment Amira lifted the badge like a sword slicing through the darkness of deceit. The crowd needed no leader. Every clap, every shout, every fiery glance wove together into a storm no speech, no rotten barrier could withstand. The second twist had been laid bare. Amira was never a victim. She was the blade. She had walked into their den, silent, recording every insult, every act of depravity. And now she stood above them, claiming victory. Blake, once so disdainful, yanked violently at his seat as if to rise and protest, but he was too late. A group of students blocked his view, lifting posters of Amira, crushing a broken shackle underfoot. The crowd's cold, piercing gaze rained down invisible spears upon him, forcing him to hunch, gasping under a humiliation he had never tasted before. Henderson collapsed into his chair, arms over his head, as if trying to block out the roaring truth. But the sound of Amira's name thundered through the air, gripping him tight, refusing to let him flee. It was not hatred that made Amira strong. It was the cold, relentless belief that justice, no matter how twisted, no matter how delayed, would always find its way home, no matter the cost. The explosion of truth inside the courtroom had barely faded before the aftershocks began ripping apart the rotten foundations of the entire system. When Amira raised her Department of Justice badge amidst a sea of people erupting for justice, the very same wrongful handcuff that once sought to shackle dignity became the hammer that smashed directly into the false wall the police department had built over decades. The Department of Justice allowed no hesitation. Within 24 hours of the hearing, emergency summonses were delivered straight to the police chief's office and the entire senior command staff. A draft consent decree over 40 pages long, every clause a cold blade stripping away every excuse, every deceitful cover, was laid flat on the conference table like an unspoken death sentence. No negotiation, no delays, no buying time. They had to sign, or the entire department would be placed under federal oversight. Every officer subjected to background investigation. Every past case dragged into the light down to the last speck of dust. The air inside the police station's meeting room thickened to the point it seemed oxygen itself had fled in disgust. A large screen was set up, live streaming footage from outside. Hundreds of citizens, students, veterans, and families of victims gathering, carrying signs, flashlights, and a silent but colossal pressure that weighed down every brick of the headquarters. With every passing minute of hesitation, the crowd swelled larger, a rising flood seeping into the rotten foundations of the system they once ruled. Police Chief Milton, who once stood proud on public stages, boasting of community trust and law and order, now hunched in his chair, staring blankly at the words on the agreement. The Elmridge Police Department acknowledges the existence of systemic civil rights violations and commits to comprehensive reforms under Department of Justice supervision. Outside the meeting room, students had plastered copies of old complaints, once buried and ignored, over the walls, each page a trembling witness to wrongful arrests, threats, and nameless abuses. Each inked word was a gravestone etched directly onto the department's decayed reputation, built atop the blood and tears of those they once despised. From the distant halls, the chants of the crowd thudded in rhythmic waves, not in words, but in the raw, pounding heartbeat of righteous fury. Wooden boards were raised high, branded with phrases like, "We do not forget, we do not forgive, we reclaim justice." Milton stammered, desperately trying to form one final plea. Could we request an independent internal review before signing? But the DOJ representative merely smirked, a smile colder than steel in winter, and replied, "You had decades for self-review. You chose cover-ups. It's too late now." Entered the room. A decorated veteran officer slowly unpinned his badge, setting it down in front of Milton with a motion so deliberate it severed the last thread tying him to a past painted in lies. Sweat poured from Milton's forehead as he glanced at his deputy chiefs, all staring blankly, stripped of even the will to resist. Some whispered half-hearted schemes, but even whispered words could no longer salvage a sinking ship. Finally, Milton's trembling hand grasped the pen. He signed, a wobbly, broken signature soaked in defeat. One by one, the others signed too, each pen stroke another slash across their own political corpses. Gone were the smug faces, the proud sneers. Only fear and hollow emptiness remained. naked under the searing light of justice. Outside, the crowd never dispersed. They stood their ground, encircling the building like an indestructible wall, their eyes burning through every brick, every shuttered window, reminding those inside that retreat was not an option this time. A small loudspeaker crackled to life, broadcasting the Department of Justice's indictment word for word. Each sentence slammed into the station like a hammer, shattering the carefully polished facade built on decades of empty speeches and hollow ceremonies. There were no public apologies, no staged press conferences, only the whistling of cold winds through protest signs, the rustle of leaves underfoot, and the steady pounding of hearts long silenced. On the courthouse steps, rough wooden placards stood defiantly under the dim light. We do not forget. Every wound, every death is etched in memory. No room for lies. Small children, hand in hand with their parents, stood tall, tiny witnesses to a moment that would not be erased. Amira stood far off, arms crossed, unsmiling, no triumphant banner raised. Her eyes, cold, deep, unyielding, watched the signatures fall onto the agreement inside the meeting room, bearing silent witness to the historic trial where the system itself, this time, bowed to the people it once crushed. A group of university students pressed closer to the barricades, lifting massive portraits of Amira, standing still under a torn sky, a wordless emblem of an unrelenting, silent revolution. Blake sat slumped in a separate isolation room, his face twisted in raw defeat. He had once believed that a single handcuff, a fabricated incident report, and a glance of contempt would be enough to bury another human into the ranks of nameless victims. But he was wrong. And his mistake, the system's mistake, had become the launching pad for an irreversible collapse. No one at the department slept peacefully that night. Doors slammed shut. Footsteps pounded in frantic retreat from the ghosts of the past. Phones rang off the hook, each call heralding another chain break. Resignation demands, badge forfeitures, federal expansion notices, even the very walls, once witnesses to countless secret meetings and whispered betrayals, now echoed every knock, every shredded document, every bitter curse spat by men who once thought themselves untouchable. Down the darkened hallways, nameplates once affixed proudly above office doors were ripped down by the security staff, tossed into black plastic bins like corpses of rotting reputations. In the front parking lot, suspended officers packed their belongings into cardboard boxes under the icy stares of town residents gathered on the sidewalks, filming, photographing, live streaming. A public indictment needing no prosecutor. One former lieutenant tried to flee quickly to his car, but was blocked by a young woman. She didn't touch him, only raised a black and white photograph of her father, wrongfully imprisoned 10 years ago. His eyes met the photo, and he crumbled like a wet rag, drained of all the lies he once told himself. From one misplaced handcuff, from a single look of disdain, from a careless threat believed to be harmless, an entire wall of deceit collapsed. And this time, no one would be able to salvage the rubble. Local diners, once eager to serve officers, now posted signs, "We serve justice, not fear." Morning news shows no longer praised law and order milestones, but instead exposed the festering record of misconduct, cover-ups, and atrocities buried under glossy reports. The system had destroyed itself, with arrogance, with greed, with the foolish belief that injustice could survive forever in the shadows. When the final reform agreement was signed, when the black ink of admission sealed their defeat, when the once arrogant faces turned as pale as shrouds waiting to be lowered over corpses, Amira stepped out of the building. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her existence, her silence, was the loudest roar in a system that had just snapped its own spine. The Elmridge Police Department stood before her like a ghost of its own making, the brick walls stained with the rot of time, the shuttered windows drooping like lifeless eyes. The city flag drooped at the gate, a rag that once flapped proudly in the winds of power, now hanging limp, beaten down by the tidal wave of distrust that had drowned it. Amira stopped, arms loose at her sides, shoulders straight, chin raised. Her eyes slid quietly over each brick, each peeling patch of paint. each scar on the carcass of an empire that once deluded itself into believing it was untouchable. No speeches, no waves, no proud expressions, only her shadow. Long, thin, solid black, stretched across the cracked cement at the station's front gate, leaving behind a silent but eternal mark. The imprint of a woman who had brought down a wall of false power all by herself. Inside the station, the lights were still on, but they no longer carried life, only a twisted, sterile glare like dried bloodstains on white cloth. Some young officers, those not yet fully stained by the callousness of their elders, watched from behind windows, their faces caught between shame and an unnamed reverence. Blake, slumped in a sealed internal room, stared blankly through a slit in the door, his eyes flooded not with hatred for Amira, but with a bottomless disgust for himself, for how he had shackled himself into the cycle of violence and lies that no fool would ever believe in again. In the patchy darkness, the heavy, mechanical footsteps of federal agents echoed down the halls, each thud a hammer blow against the casket of a rotten legacy. Every time the sound drew nearer, Blake shrank deeper into himself, as if each footfall crushed another shard of his shattered delusions. Milton, the police chief, silently packed his belongings into an old cardboard box. His tarnished badge lay discarded on the desk like a broken toy. He knew that no matter how quietly he tried to leave, no matter how many records he tried to burn, the past would chase him down like a bloodhound, relentless and merciless. Outside the windows, the crowd still stood vigil, their cold stares pressing against every pane, every brick, every breath of those who had once used the law to suffocate justice. An elderly woman pressed her hand against the glass, the faded photograph of her son beside her, a stain no falsified report could ever erase. Amira didn't look into their eyes. She didn't need to. She had seen enough. Her steps, slow but sure, echoed across the streets like a royal drumbeat hammering down on the heads of those who had once bowed before a counterfeit throne. The old stone pavement seemed to tremble beneath her stride, as if desperate to remember each footfall. The day a woman stood tall and forced those who once cuffed her to bow down to the truth. The station's front doors were bolted shut, but in the alleyways, citizens began spray-painting graffiti in thick black strokes. The image of a shattered handcuff and the words, "Justice bled here." No one dared paint over it. No one dared pretend it hadn't happened. The once whitewashed walls laid bare their cracks, deep, gaping wounds that no fresh coat could conceal. There were no honor guards, no red ribbons, no thunderous applause. Only a solitary figure walking the streets, leaving behind a frozen police station, trembling in the cold darkness of its own sins. A sharp winter wind whipped down the empty streets, carrying dry leaves and dust, peeling the faded posters off the sidewalk. The sign in front of the station, once proudly proclaiming Elmridge Police Department, was flaking apart, letter by letter, as if confessing its guilt with each falling chip. Amira never looked back. She simply walked forward, her shadow slicing across the street, imprinting itself on every window, every wall, every shuttered eye. The shadow of a woman who did not need to scream to be heard, did not need a gun to command respect, did not need to trample others to weather the storm. That shadow, silent, unyielding, eternal, would remain long after any statue, long after any headline, long after fleeting songs of praise faded away. Because sometimes history isn't written in roaring battles or bloody uprisings. Sometimes history only needs one person, standing tall, walking through and leaving behind a world that has no choice but to change, whether it wants to or not. Amira's shadow still stretched across the street as other doors, other hearts began to open. No rallying cries, no fiery speeches. The uprising had already begun, silent but unstoppable, like a breached underground river, like a spring bursting through bedrock long thought impenetrable. At every street corner, flyers for civil rights watchdog meetings appeared, plastered on lampposts, bus stops, and the very walls that once bore silent witness to injustice. Names that had once been invisible victims, crushed under fabricated reports and falsified records, now stood proudly in public view. In neighborhoods once choked by fear, handheld lights flickered through the darkness, recording every step, every word, as if every citizen had now become a living witness that could no longer be silenced. What began as small gatherings grew into overflowing assemblies, where faces that once avoided each other on sidewalks now locked hands, building a fortress of solidarity no badge-wielding power could penetrate. A coalition of black mothers formed the Liberty Mothers Collective, determined to monitor every arrest, every patrol, every trial. They carried no weapons. They bore cameras, voice recorders, and a silent, unbreakable strength that clung to every patrol like a shadow that could not be chased away. Officers who once swaggered through random stops and searches now twitched at the glint of a handheld LED, knowing that their every move was under relentless scrutiny. Hand-painted signs dangled from lampposts and traffic lights. "We are watching. Justice is watching. No more blind corners for oppression to hide." The men who once bowed their heads under the threat of nightsticks now walked the streets with their children, hosting community gatherings in the Central Park, the same park where not long ago gatherings of more than 5 could trigger harassment and dispersal, where polished boots once stomped to silence voices. Now rap battles, poetry readings, and speeches rang out under the starlit sky. When a few disgraced officers wandered close, the crowd simply lifted their phones, recording, without a word, the quietest, most brutal reminder that power had shifted. Workshops teaching civil rights law sprang up on sidewalks, inside churches, and in abandoned schoolyards. Places that once swallowed their own shame now transformed into sanctuaries of knowledge and self-defense. People learned how to record, how to request warrants, how to file lawsuits, how to stack each personal pain into the bricks of a collective shield. New slogans appeared: "Know the law, save a life." One camera, one survival. Every evidence, another nail in injustice's coffin. No one believed hollow promises anymore. No one waited for justice to arrive on its own. They became justice, one person at a time, one neighborhood at a time. Not with riots, not with chaos, but with a steadfastness so deep that even violence and deceit had to fear it. Every afternoon, at intersections once known for random stops, volunteers in reflective jackets took their posts. Unarmed, no badges, only sharp eyes and notepads, monitoring every encounter between police and civilians. Their presence, quiet yet immovable, whispered a truth into the wind. Real authority no longer sat in holsters or handcuffs. Community bulletin boards at bus stops listed every officer under investigation, every pending civil case, each line a chisel mark against the crumbling facade of those who once thought themselves untouchable. Whenever a patrol car rolled down the street, it no longer passed unseen. It passed under a forest of raised phone. From his dingy apartment, hiding from the crowds he once controlled, Blake watched these scenes unfold on his cracked screen. The very faces he used to sneer at from behind his badge now lit up the town with a fire he could not smother. In one video, a 12-year-old black boy stood in the middle of the street, holding a sign that read, "I know my rights." His stance so firm, it seemed the phone camera itself shook under the force of it. Blake shut the device off, but the chants for justice, the clapping, the calls for Amira's name, thundered on inside his skull like a sentence with no appeal. Henderson, ousted from the force and shunned by his old comrades like a diseased mutt, wandered the empty sidewalks, his knees buckling when he saw black children practicing their rights beneath flickering street lamps. At a corner he once terrorized with citations and shouts, a new cafe had sprung up, a community hub hosting weekly workshops titled, "Know Your Rights, Stay Alive." No one invited him inside. No one asked if he was lost. He was a ghost haunting streets that once trembled at his boots. No one could deny it anymore. The silence that had once been institutionalized, polished into order and stability, was now shattered beyond repair by the very people it had tried to break. In the town center, a new electronic billboard glowed bright red against the night. Everyone is being watched, especially those wearing badges. Officers who still clung to the crumbling system lowered their heads on patrol, knowing now every eye on the street was a judge waiting to render a verdict. A massive mural began taking shape on the cracked wall behind the old town hall. It depicted Amira, not with a crown or a slogan, but simply standing still, arms at her sides, gaze locked forward, surrounded by hundreds of other faces, young and old, dark and light, each one staring boldly into the future. The community had awakened, and once awake it would not be lulled back to sleep by slogans or cheap apologies. From small apartment meetings to open-air gatherings under flickering streetlights, from murmured conversations in coffee shops to viral news clips, the once silent voices rose, not with shrieks, not with rage, but with an unbreakable, quiet insistence that no violence could drown out. Each time a video surfaced showing a shady traffic stop, each time a news story unearthed another buried wrongdoing, another crack spread across the rotting mask worn by false justice. Across the gray stone walls of the town, graffiti slogans appeared, crude but undeniable. "We see you, no one above the law. Justice wears no uniform." Amira never appeared at the meetings. She didn't need to. She knew the real battle wasn't fought in speeches or headlines, and it was fought in daily decisions. The choice to stand, the refusal to be silent, the decision to reach for another's hand instead of lowering one's head. Sometimes it was enough for two strangers to meet eyes on the sidewalk, to share a silent nod at a bus stop, to remember that the unseen ties between them were growing stronger every day, choking the life out of the old powers that had once thrived in legal and moral gray zones. Blake, locked away in his cheap rental, dared not step outside. He watched as his former empire was repainted with murals, filled with community fairs, overrun with citizens pledging themselves not to fear but to freedom. And in those quiet moments, when a mother taught her child about the right to remain silent, when a teenager recorded a traffic stop, when a little girl stood and recited the Fourth Amendment in class, a silent revolution took root. Unstoppable, no more fearful glances when a cruiser passed, no more hushed conversations broken by dread. Even the schools, churches, and aging playgrounds became grounds where civic rights were passed down like sacred seeds planted deep in fertile soil. The rise of the once silenced voices needed no grand declarations. It lived, sturdy and unshakable, in the very breath of the reborn community. In every phone lifted against injustice, in every quiet act of defiance, in every shared glance of determination. On street corners, electronic signs flashed nightly. "Know your rights. We do not forget," beating in rhythm with thousands of hearts refusing to be lulled again. In diners and storefront windows hung small, handmade signs. "Safety is a right, not a privilege. Recording saves lives." Carved reminders that the lessons written in blood and tears would not be forgotten. Because once, when a woman dared to stand tall against a storm, the shadows that thought they could crush her realized she had become the stars, and those stars would light the sky forever, undeniable and free. From the scattered early voices, like tiny crackling sparks in the dark, a great fire began to take shape. Not by reckless passion, but by a silent, profound quake that struck against every brick of a town that thought it had long grown accustomed to silence. And then, on a cold gray afternoon, when the wind whipped through the worn streets like the whispered promises of a new generation, a black boy, no older than 12, climbed onto a battered wooden crate at the center square, facing the faded town hall and the shuttered, trembling police station under the freezing twilight, and raised a voice that had never truly been heard before. There was no microphone, no television cameras, no flowery speeches prepared in advance. Only the boy, his school uniform faded from too many washes, his sneakers worn thin at the heels, and his eyes, deep, black, steady like mountain stone, staring straight into the crowd gathering before him, at the adults gripping each other's hands, at the other children clutching their parents' coat hems, at the photographers snapping furtively from a distance, and even at those once powerful figures now cowering behind cold glass windows. The boy's voice did not tremble, not because he had never known fear, but because he had understood through every silent wound his family, his neighborhood, his community had borne over the years, that if he did not speak now, there might never be another chance. "My name is Elijah Green," the boy began, each word clear and firm, hammering into the concrete like stakes into new ground. "I stand here not because I am stronger than anyone. I stand here because I am tired of walking through the streets I was born in like I am a beggar in my own home." A cold gust swept through the square, carrying his words farther, higher, as if the very air had stilled itself just to listen. Under the sickly yellow streetlights, the faces around Elijah, faces once bowed by fear, seemed reshaped by an invisible force. A grizzled old man nearby, who had spent decades lowering his eyes before power, gripped the tiny hand of his shivering grandson, not from fear, but from pride. In the cafe across the square, patrons who had once slunk away from police now stood pressed against the windows, phones raised, capturing each moment, as if terrified of missing something sacred beginning to unfold. On the highest rooftop, the city's tarnished flag, once stained by lies and false reports, was lowered, replaced by a rough strip of white cloth hastily painted with the words, "We bow no more." "I stand here," Elijah continued, unwavering, "because I know that freedom is not something handed down by anyone's kindness. It is something we must claim, seize, and hold on to, even when our hands bleed." The crowd, initially hesitant, wary, now tightened its ranks, their eyes igniting with a belief that had been absent from this town for decades. No one thought of Blake anymore, cowering in his dingy hideout, staring helplessly at a screen as the town he once crushed rose up, one person, one generation at a time, no longer afraid. No one spoke of Henderson, slinking through the alleys, swallowed by a community that had learned to remember the faces of abusers instead of fearing them. Each word Elijah spoke drove like a drill into the hardened earth, shattering the thick layers of deceit, fear, and resignation. A child lifted her small hand. A grandmother, tears streaming, shakily raised a decades-old citation she had hidden at the bottom of her drawer. Among the crowd, a group of teenagers erupted into a raw, unchoreographed chant that shook the drab buildings to their foundations. "We do not forget. We do not forgive. We will not back down." In that moment, the glow of hundreds of phones lit up, not for selfies, not for spectacle, but to illuminate the faces that had lived too long in the shadows, now basking in the fierce, unrelenting light of truth. And when Elijah fell silent, when his final words dissolved into the heavy, pulsing air, no one moved, no one wanted to leave, as if stepping away might extinguish the flame they had just dared to ignite. But no one stepped back, no one looked for a leader to follow, because in that moment, each person had become their own leader. For the first time in many years, the crowd was not a mass of shadows. They became a constellation, stars lighting the night, and from now on, no darkness could smother them. "I stand here," Elijah said, gripping the worn wooden crate, "for the mothers who cry silently every time their children step out the door. I stand here for the fathers forced to bow their heads under a system that sees them as nothing more than statistics. I stand here for the brothers and sisters who disappeared quietly because they saw no way to win without being crushed." Then, in a silence that stretched to eternity, Elijah lifted his chin, his young eyes sweeping across the square, and with a voice both steely and tender, he declared, "We will be silent no more. We will speak, we will stand, and we will never kneel before injustice again." The first clap came from an old woman, her face carved deep with the wrinkles of a lifetime endured. Then a second, then a third. Then the entire square exploded in a thunderous applause. Fierce, relentless, uncontrollable. These were not claps for a boy. They were blows struck against a system that once thought it could silence every voice that dared to resist. On rooftops surrounding the square, white fabric banners unfurled, painted by ordinary hands, no justice, no peace. Street-front cafes flung open their doors, and loudspeakers blasted the song Glory into the night, a confirmation that from tonight onward, this town had crossed a threshold it would never retreat from. Handmade signs sprouted through the crowd. Justice now. No more silence. We are not afraid. A small child, perched on his father's shoulders, hoisted a crumpled cardboard sign. I want to grow up. No one cried out in anguish. No one screamed in rage. They stood, hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, an unspoken vow etched into the cold air. We will not back down, and we will not lose another generation. Blake, from his hideout, stared at the scenes streaming through his battered phone, his face crumpled like wet paper, his wild eyes flashing, not with hate, but with a terror deeper than anything he had ever known. For the first time, power had truly slipped from his hands, never to return. Videos of the uprising spread across social media at lightning speed, captioned with searing simplicity. We see you. We forget nothing. Elmridge has awakened. Henderson, wandering through abandoned streets, heard the chants rolling from the square like waves crashing against the cliffs, relentless and unstoppable. He tugged his cap low and scurried into the darkness, a ghost chased from a world that no longer had space for his kind. The doors that once opened with uneasy smiles now slammed shut. The eyes that once dropped to the pavement now stared him down, cold, steady, fearless. No diner offered him a seat. No neighborhood offered him shelter. Elmridge, the town he once thought he could stomp into submission, now stood upright, defiant, unbreakable, like a storm no tyrant could survive. And Amira, the woman who had lit the first flame, stood quietly at a corner, hood drawn over her head, no badge, no banner, no need for recognition. She smiled, a soft smile like a breeze in the storm as she watched Elijah Green and hundreds of other Elijah Greens learning to stand tall on their own in a world that had once forced them to their knees. Because where the disregarded rise, where trembling feet now stamp the ground with pride, that is where a new chapter of freedom is written, in blood, in tears, and in voices that will never be silenced again. The echoes of Elijah Green's voice still lingered warm in the air as other flames, other voices, and other resolves began to ignite across the town like a galaxy awakening after a suffocating night. But Amira knew, if everything ended with mere applause, with slogans slapped on wooden boards, the fire would eventually be forgotten by the winds. So she did not wait. She did not seek glory. She did not step onto any golden pedestal. She acted quietly, steadily, like a farmer sowing seeds into soil once parched by despair. Just 3 days later, in a rundown community hall long abandoned, a place where children once played among peeling walls, Amira started hosting free civil rights training sessions. No banners, no media coverage, no news articles, only flyers printed by hand, passed discreetly through shops, cafes, churches. If you want to know your rights, if you want to learn how to stand up, come, and they came. First, the single mothers with worried eyes, the fathers tired of bowing their heads during random stops, the young black men leaning against walls, half skeptical, half drawn to the unbreakable flame Amira carried like a tiny torch against the night. Amira did not deliver speeches. She did not talk about herself. She simply flicked on an old projector and went through the Bill of Rights, clause by clause, explaining the rights that had been twisted into luxuries for far too long. She taught how to legally record encounters, how to speak without being baited into violence, how to recognize blatant violations and respond with law, not fists. She gave vivid examples, not just from textbooks but from real lives she had witnessed. The father fired for filing a complaint, the mother handcuffed in front of her daughter for asking too loudly, the child shoved in a schoolyard with no one held accountable. Each night, more people came. Extra chairs spilled out onto the sidewalk. Lines of listeners stood pressed against cracked windows, huddled under the flickering yellow streetlights, hanging on to every word. And gradually, faces once timid straightened their backs. Hands that once trembled over complaint forms now gripped pens with unwavering steadiness. Eyes that once flinched at the sight of a patrol car now stared back, not with hatred, but with the steel confidence that said, "I know who I am. I know my rights." Blake, hunkered down in his dingy apartment, drowning in news from every direction, could not resist watching the live streams of these sessions. Every lesson Amira taught, every child who stood up and declared, "We will not be silent," hammered another crack into the shell of self-delusion he clung to, a shell so fractured now that even a breeze might shatter it completely. Henderson, wandering past the square where community classes were now being held, saw black, brown, and white children sitting in circles beneath fluttering flags, chanting the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, as if performing sacred rites for a new generation that would never again know submission. He tugged his cap low to hide his face, but shame clung to him so deeply that not even the shadows could shield it. Amira remained silent. She gave no interviews, accepted no TV invitations, refused every offer of accolades, because to her victory was not a single triumphant event to celebrate. It was a grueling, relentless journey that had to be renewed every day through action. One evening, after a session ended, a little girl with braided hair shyly approached and handed Amira a small, handwritten card. "You taught me that I am not invisible. I promise I will never let anyone steal my voice again." Amira folded the card carefully and tucked it into her pocket like a talisman. No grand promises, no blaring speeches, just a vow. Small, quiet, but powerful enough to stir the heaven. And so those vows, one by one, heart by heart, arm by raised arm, began weaving into a net so strong that no handcuff, no gun, no falsified report could ever pierce it again. Not just once, not just through one protest or one trial, but through a new oath, living inside every step they took, every breath they drew, every glance they exchanged. That justice was not a gift to be given, but a right they would seize for themselves forever. From those quiet but burning oaths, from those steadfast eyes staring into the future, from those firm steps no longer shackled by fear or shame, something miraculous began to take shape, not through orders, not through money, not through blaring media, but through a determination smoldering into every alley, every street corner, every heart once buried beneath the weight of oppression. One morning, as the sun crested the faded rooftops, the people of Elmridge awoke to find something no one had expected. On the crumbling brick wall behind City Hall, once a symbol of arrogant rule and unjust verdicts, now stood a colossal mural. It was not flashy, not gaudy, but sharp, powerful, and profound enough to tighten the chest of anyone who looked upon it. Amira Washington, not wearing robes, not wielding a sword, not standing on a pedestal of triumph, was simply herself, standing tall, hands loose at her sides, chin lifted, her gaze calm yet cutting through the space, an unmoving milestone amid the raging storm of history. Above the mural, painted in stark white letters, both graceful and unyielding, were the words, "Justice is parking here." No explanation was needed, no analysis required. The entire city understood instantly that line was a slap across the face of all those who had once believed they could handcuff justice over a mere parking violation. People pulled over their cars, stepped out, and stood before the wall for hours. Elderly couples embraced and wept. Young people clenched their fists, their eyes burning bright like newly risen stars. Children scrambled onto curbs, pointed at the words, and asked their parents, "Who is she?" And this time, the answer came without stuttering, without shame. "She's the one who taught us that we deserve to be heard." Blake, hiding out in a dingy motel on the city's outskirts, sat frozen before his phone screen, deep lines of bitterness etched across his face as he watched streams of people lining up to take pictures beneath that mural. No one remembered him anymore. No one feared him anymore. Blake's name had ceased to be a symbol of authority. It had become a cursed whisper lost among the rising footsteps of a town reborn. Henderson, passing through the square, caught sight of the mural and the gathering crowd. He ducked his head and hurried past, as if hoping his own shadow would not dare stain the wall that now blazed so defiantly. But it was useless, for shame, once planted by cowardice, takes root deeper than any punishment ever could. Amira Washington's name began appearing in places no one would have predicted. On T-shirts, on keychains, on posters pinned inside classrooms, even tattooed onto the wrists of teenagers. Not as a deity to worship, but as a permanent reminder that even the smallest individual can pierce the darkness if they have the courage to stand tall. She had never asked for this. She had never sought it. But precisely because she never demanded it, never flaunted it, never sought the spotlight, the name Amira Washington grew even larger, even more sacred. At school opening ceremonies, teachers recited passages about civil rights, but now they added a new line. Remember, right here, in our own town, someone made it real. Graduation essays began using Amira's story, not as history assignments, but as road maps for the future. Her name, once brushed aside with scorn, once dismissed by rusted uniforms and rotten hearts, had become a symbol, not forged by gunfire, not built on threats, not cemented by imposed power, but by silent resilience, steely defiance, and the heavy, immovable silence of one woman who refused to kneel before injustice. One windy evening, as the trees bent under dim streetlights, an elderly woman, a silent witness to Elmridge's darkest days, was seen slowly laying a bouquet of white flowers at the foot of the mural. No banners, no ceremonies, just a whisper she sent into the breeze, "Thank you for everything." And thus, in a small town that had forgotten how to lift its head, that had forgotten how to love itself, that had once bowed just to survive, the name Amira Washington became etched into the earth, into memory, into flesh and blood across generations, as a vow that justice would no longer be a distant dream, but would settle permanently on the very ground from which it had once been stolen. By the time Amira Washington's name had become a whispered symbol across the walls, scribbled onto school boards, and tattooed onto the wrists of children who had never known fear, she quietly stepped away from the lights, slowly igniting in her name. Not because she rejected recognition, but because Amira had never entered this fight to be remembered. She wanted, from the very beginning, something far simpler and far more bitter, the right to stand upright in this world without asking permission. That afternoon, as the golden hue of sunset poured across streets still bearing scars of injustice, Amira walked slowly along the cobbled path leading to the town square. No entourage, no cameras thrust in her face, no trembling microphone, just her and her shadow. Long, slender, unyielding, stretched across the pavement like an undeniable witness. The townspeople stood silently along the sidewalks, watching her every step. They did not cheer, they did not clap, they were only their eyes, burning, misty, alight, desperate to embrace her presence without daring to disrupt the sacredness of that moment. Blake, holed up in a dark room of a crumbling past he had built for himself, stared through the cracked screen of his battered phone. He saw Amira, no badge, no crown, no symbols, and he understood with the searing bitterness of one utterly defeated that some victories require no gunfire, no flags, but can raise empires simply by refusing to kneel. Henderson, dragging himself like a misshapen shadow among the crowd, shrank when he passed by her. But Amira did not look at him. She didn't need to. Her existence, proud and composed, was the most devastating answer he would carry until his last breath. As Amira walked beneath the mural bearing the words, "Justice is parking here," an early winter breeze stirred, lifting a small white scrap of paper that twirled through the air before landing by her feet. On it, scribbled in a child's shaky handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for teaching us. We can stand tall too." Amira bent down, gently folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket. That simple gesture, more powerful than any medal, caused the entire space to hold its breath. No one moved. No one dared speak, because in that moment words were too small to contain the enormity of what her quiet presence meant. She continued walking, blending into the crowd, disappearing into the heartbeat of a city, learning to live again, not under the shadow of handcuffs, not under veiled threats, but under the blinding light of awakening. No one tried to stop her. No one begged her to stay, but in every glance that followed her, in every trembling breath held in reverence, there was an unspoken vow that she had been here, that she had stood tall, that she had taught them how to stand tall, and that was enough. No statues were built for Amira Washington. No streets were renamed in her honor. No holidays were declared to commemorate her. But at every street corner, every alleyway, every worn stone step, wherever once bowed heads now lifted proudly, wherever once trembling children now laughed freely, wherever once crushed hearts now beat like war drums, Amira Washington lived on, without the need for any title. And that, in itself, was the greatest victory. As her figure faded down the street, there remained only the echo of a steady, unhurried walk, a silhouette quietly etched into history, not with the deafening roar of slogans, but with the steady gravity of a simple, irrefutable truth. Justice does not need a name to exist. It only needs people standing tall, silent, and unyielding. A final winter breeze swept through, scattering dried leaves, carrying with it the unspoken hymns of gratitude, like an unnamed anthem, bidding farewell to the woman who needed no crown, no throne, but had carved her name forever into the beating heart of a city reborn. And if you've stayed to this point, and you feel something stirring in your chest, a memory, an old injustice you once endured, or simply a longing to never let anyone stand alone again, then please, don't hesitate. Leave a comment. Share your story with us. No matter who you are, where you come from, or what you've faced, your voice deserves to be heard. Every story you share, every thought you leave beneath this video, is not just a continuation of Amira's spirit, but another small flame keeping the fire alive for hearts that almost forgot how to hope. Because justice doesn't only live on murals, it lives in every breath, every hand, every word written by those who still believe in kindness. If you believe this story deserves to be heard, if you want the messages of courage and resilience to echo beyond fleeting noise, please share this video with someone who needs it, and subscribe to our channel. Not because it changes the world overnight, but because it could change someone's small world, starting with yours. Thank you for staying until this very last line, and thank you for choosing to listen in a world that too often chooses to shout.